slides. It worked. Hi, good evening. As I guess many of you have figured out, I'm one of the children of Tom, and I have been charged tonight with serving as your MC for the events. Many of you have come to me in the weeks up to now expecting me to talk at length. I don't plan to do that tonight. I'm really here to help launch what is truly a spectacular achievement, which is my father Tom's book, A Singular Vision, Architecture, Art, and Landscape. Tonight's program is going to do a little bit of a shift on the title of the book. We are going to start with Richard Armstrong talking about art collection, Dad's interest in art. And I recognized this today as I was going over the passages that I'm going to read from. And I thought we might have a problem, that we should perhaps go like the title, architecture first, art second, and landscape third. But in reading the book, I realized that Dad was quite candid about many things. And over the years, I've also suspected this, but really found it very clearly laid out in the book, that he really wasn't able to distinguish between art, architecture, or landscape. It was all the same to him. It was something that he really just brought a vision to. Many of the biographical details in the book point to a person struggling with making life choices, as many of us have experienced. And for him, it was choosing between being a farmer, let's call that landscape, and also, or an artist. And for that reason, I think we're going to be fine going with the order that we have things laid out in. And I don't want to take up too much time in between each of the speakers, because I know we're getting a bit of a late start, and I also want to sell a ton of books, because Christmas is coming, and this really, it will be one of the great gifts for the Christmas holiday. In between each of the readers, I thought it would be nice to just read a few selections from the book to try to warm up the topic that you'll hear from. So starting with art, I'm going to read what I think is the first sentence of the book, and then a few other passages describing how it all really began. For more than 60 years, I have either made art, studied art, collected art, or presented art to the public. This book is about the joy of seeing, of having a particular visual response, to art and design within a house and its adjacent landscape. In the early 1950s, I studied to become an artist at Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. This was a time when the formal aspects of modernism, particularly the concepts of abstraction, entered academia and were taught as a revolutionary way of realizing imagery. Lessons I learned then have never left me, and ever since that time, I have viewed art and my environment through the lens of abstraction and the formalist theories of space, light, and form. I don't want you to get scared by that. It's all pretty straightforward stuff, as you'll see, but abstraction turns out to be one of the major themes weaving its way through the three main topics of the book. I'll end reading the passages about art with a quote not from the book, but from the Architectural Digest article on the house that was in the October 2010 edition, written by Joseph Giovannini. Inadvertently, he fulfilled an early aspiration. He arranged color, texture, shape, line, and materials into a total environmental canvas, a complex and abstract painting that happens to be alive. Armstrong became the artist he wanted to be. So without further ado, why don't we hear a little bit more about art and Armstrong from Richard Armstrong. Thank you, Richard.
So let's begin by my thanking the family and contradicting Whitney in that Tom's attraction to abstraction, sorry for that alliteration, I think was one that came to him with some time and maturation. In fact, we're looking here at probably his most important early addition to a collection, and it's far from being abstract. This is Robert Laurent's Birth of Venus from 1947, now situated in one of the gardens at the property in Fisher's Island. But in the old days, starting in the 1970s, when Tom came to the Whitney Museum and the family moved to 765 Park Avenue, this was in the foyer and was certainly an attention getter for its scale and its inherent goofiness, I would say. It's typical of Tom that because he was a tremendously loyal person, I think he'd gone to Ogunquit, Maine to interview Laurent, who's a French-born artist, but a connoisseur of American folk art, while Tom himself was the director of the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Collection in Williamsburg. So to me, this is a typical demonstration of his deep interest in the people that he came across as both a symbol of support and the beginnings of his recognizing that he himself could be a collector. We should admit to each other that he was shy about that activity the whole time that he was the director of the Whitney Museum. I'm a little empathetic in that there's a possibility always of being seen as a kind of inside trader. And beyond that, frequently our budgets don't quite match what the market asks for. I remember also at the Park Avenue apartment frequently seeing a Jan Matulka painting. Again, this was a Czech-born artist who had big influence in the 1930s and 40s, and it's interesting that Tom's taste, as it demonstrates itself later, is really bracketed from the late 1930s to about 1975 or 80. That's really the era that I think he has the deepest connection to. The Matulka painting, as I recall, would frequently be over the sideboard in the dining room. It's one of those pictures that itself was not certain whether it was an abstraction or representational painting. And I also recall on loan from the Whitney Museum the occasional Edward Hopper painting. If you visited Hoover Hall, and I was lucky to several times as I recall, you'll remember that it's a bit of a pile and beautifully designed on the interior with Pam Banker, and the distinguishing feature were Tom's really very impressive collection of Mark Catesby hand-colored first edition engravings, the great English-born but American practicing naturalist, and then throughout the house were a number of Tiffany accessories. You'd see lots of faux bamboo and wicker furniture. The general theme, I think, was really flora and fauna with a kind of particular interest in American animal sculpture, which graced nearly every tabletop and mantelpiece. So here's a typical bedroom, casual. The dining room, which was really the scene for great happiness because Tom and Bunty were tremendously good hosts and had a great cook also. And here you could sit out and see the Long Island Sound, or if you had the opposing seats, you could see typically quite interesting people. You'll notice that the decoration here, again, has lots of colored glass, mostly Steuben, and a very important Audubon print over that side table. And then one more view. This was the sitting room downstairs. So you see the house had a certain kind of ambiance to it that related to the outdoors, but in a way that might be typified as more 19th century. It was a great tragedy in December 16, 2003, when the house caught fire. And I know Tom was devastated by that, and rightfully so, because he'd spent the previous several years really putting together an unusual ensemble, both in the interior and in the exterior. But insurance claims against losses here, and I think people on the island were heroic in dragging material out of the burning house. In any case, the insurance claims, according to him in the book, offered him an art purchase fund for the first time in his adult life. So I'm handicapped in not having seen the new house, but here we go to look at things inside that. I'm sure Tom Pfeiffer will give you a big overview of its organization and meaning. This is, as I understand it, the sitting room decorated with this important but unfinished painting by the American artist Myron Stout, Apollo, 1955. I'm just realizing we went from Venus to Apollo. Myron Stout is one of those very private, cultish painters in American art history. He was born in Texas, but he really had his practice in Provincetown, Massachusetts, deeply connected to ideas that Hans Hofmann had. And the picture is, it seems to me, typical of the very light spirit that'll pervade this new house, completely unlike the previous house, I would say. In that same room or nearby, a piece by Richard Stankiewicz, a lesser known but very important abstract artist. This is Untitled, 1960. Again, you can see Tom's willingness to, in effect, move himself into modernism. This is an assemblage junk artist who had something of a career. In New York, he was quite powerful in the 1960s, eclipsed after that period. Then in a very elegant gesture, Adam Weinberg, the new director of the Whitney Museum and Tom's favorite successor, I'm certain, made a wonderful Richard Stankiewicz show when he was head of the Addison Gallery up at Andover. This is an artist who is also in the Whitney Museum collection, and that's a bit of a motif in Tom's choices. As he says in the passage that Whitney quoted from, over that 60-year period, he collected, painted, and then we should underscore the word presented, because he was the guiding force behind many, many, many exhibitions at the Rockefeller Folk Art Museum, then at the Pennsylvania Academy, where he had a brief but influential stay. More significantly, at the Whitney Museum, where he took the museum to, I would say, new heights of seriousness and ferociously demonstrated his own ambition by buying very expensive paintings, even though the museum had limited funds, but he was always lucky and persuasive in getting good donors to come forward. We had a little party recently at the Whitney Museum, and I characterized him as thrift adverse. And that serves you well when you're the head of a museum. It's more complicated when you're a private individual. Then the big monument in the collection for Hooverness is this super 1966 piece by the Chinese-born but Italian Jewish artist, Mark de Suvero. Mark had a giant show at the Whitney Museum in 1975, so this was really one of the first big exhibitions in Tom's tenure at the Whitney, and the book tells about his success in working with Doris Friedman to have Mark de Suvero monuments cited in every borough, typical of Tom's tremendous ambition and willingness to share art with people all over the city. This piece was in that 1975 show, and parenthetically, I can say that I was the underbidder for it at the auction on behalf of collectors from Pittsburgh who weren't quite as thrift adverse as Tom. It's again another demonstration of this idea of collage, and in some ways we could say that that's the most distinguishing feature of 20th century art. Today, abstraction, which is Tom's obsession in the text of the book, has become a kind of an eclipsed practice, and it looks like it connects to a sense of utopia that we may or may not share any longer. But here we see in these so-called junk artists from the late 50s and early 60s a willingness to incorporate otherwise ignoble material into very beautiful compositions. And in painting, for example, we think especially of Robert Rauschenberg's taste for going into the outer world and incorporating that into artistic expression.